Hi guys, recently Viltrox released a world's first, a 16mm f1.8 lens for full frame cameras. This was the only 16 1.8 lens in existence. Well, today, Sony has said, pardon the heck out of my gosh darn French, but did you just threaten me? And they came out with a smaller, lighter, better in almost every way version to this Viltrox 16, and it is pretty close in price, so we need to talk about it. This right here is the brand new Sony 16mm f1.8 G lens, and it obviously is going to compete with the Viltrox 16 1.8, but also maybe the Sony 16-25 2.8. I really love this lens. It is my most used lens right now. Very compact for a zoom, but it is more expensive and an f2.8. Also a little bit bigger and heavier, obviously, than this Sony lens. This Sony lens is tiny. It is 303 grams on my scale. And when you compare this to the 558 grams of this Viltrox 16, you can see how much better this would be to carry around for long periods of time, or if you want to do something like gimbal work. And of course, I should mention that Sony sent this lens out. It is only a loaner. I don't get to keep it. I have to send it back. No money changed hands. They haven't told me what to say. They did give me a briefing on the lens, and then they said, go do your thing that we won't watch. And here we are. Wide-angle lenses like a 16mm are very popular for landscape photography and cityscape photography, also astrophotography when you have an f1.8. But these lenses are getting much more popular these days as well for people who want to do some handheld video work where they want to show their beautiful faces, call it vlogging, call it content creation. A lot of people want a wide-angle lens so that when they hold their camera out at arm's length, they still have a nice wide field of view. And this one right here, the ZV-E1, when it uses its dynamic active stabilization, it actually crops in a nice bit to give you that super smooth gimbal-like footage, so a 16mm is very welcomed for that. So let's talk about the build quality, and it's exactly what you would expect from a Sony G lens. It feels very premium. It is made mostly of hard plastic, which does keep the weight down, but a lot of lenses these days are being made of the hard plastic, including the G Masters. It has an aperture ring that can be clicked or declicked. Very satisfying clicks, just Sony quality. It's just so great. And it has a nice rubber ring for your manual focus. It has an autofocus to manual focus switch and a focus hold button as well. And it has an iris lock if you want to leave it in automatic or put it in fully manual. It does have a rubber gasket on the back for weather sealing. Sony says this is dust and moisture resistant, but not, of course, guaranteed 100% dust and moisture resistant. They want to cover their butts, legally speaking. As a very common filter thread size of 67mm, which is welcome for me because a lot of my Sony lenses have a 67mm filter thread. Now, since we'll be comparing this a lot to the Viltrox 16, I'll talk about its build quality. It actually feels extremely premium. It is a mostly metal lens, which does contribute, unfortunately, to its weight. It has two focus hold buttons, an autofocus to manual focus switch, an aperture ring that can be clicked or declicked, and it has a little screen, an LCD screen that lights up. And now some people might think that is a gimmick, but when you are doing astrophotography, which a lot of people might want with this lens, it is nice to see that illuminated so you can see your settings right there. So I think that is a bit of an advantage for the Viltrox, but a lot of people don't care at all about this little screen. Like the Sony, it is a weather seal lens. It does have a USB-C port for firmware updates on the base and a 77mm filter thread. When we're talking about optical performance, it is great news almost across the board here. Autofocus has those XD linear focus motors, so it's just instantly fast, so smooth, so sticky. If you're using an A9 III, it will keep up with that 120 frames per second. It is just phenomenal what Sony has done with the autofocus systems between the cameras and the lenses. It is my favorite part of the Sony system, and this thing is perfection. The autofocus is dead silent and can focus in extremely dim conditions, And the focus breathing is very minimal on this lens, even without focus breathing compensation. Now, most of the Sony cameras, the new ones, have focus breathing compensation, so you can make it absolutely pristine and perfect. However, even without focus breathing compensation, this thing has almost no focus breathing at all. Sharpness, it is an extremely sharp lens. If you compare it to the viltrox, which is also a sharp lens, it is sharper when you are down at f1.8 and all through the range. Sharper in the center and sharper in the corner. So this viltrox lens is no slouch. It is a great lens and it is very sharp, but the Sony has upped the game here. And in case you're wondering, the 16-25 f2.8 actually holds up in sharpness quite well against this 16 1.8. Even when you stop it down to 2.8 and you have them at the same aperture, then this competes mightily. It looks almost indistinguishable, which is crazy for a zoom lens to be this sharp. A 16-25 that is really as sharp as one really sharp prime lens. I think that is pretty remarkable. Again, I love this lens. The bokeh is nice and soft, very pleasing backgrounds, things that are in focus to out of focus, it falls off very nicely, and this one has a pretty good minimum focus distance, especially when you compare it to this viltrox. This is a 0.15 meter focus distance, so 15 centimeter focus distance, whereas this guy right here is 27 centimeters, so almost double the minimum focus distance, and you can really see that. So if you want to get close to your subject, have that wide angle photography where you get close to your subject and then you blow out that background, then this lens is going to do far better than this one right here. And when it comes to the bokeh balls, these aren't the nicest balls I've ever seen. Don't read anything into that, but they are pretty good, especially for a wide angle lens, and they are a lot better than the viltrox. The ones on the viltrox, well, first of all, they're pretty small because of that minimum focus distance, so when I was blurring out the background there, the bokeh balls don't look quite as big and round, and they're also much messier in the center, whereas the bokeh balls on this 16 1.8 are really quite good for a wide angle lens. No haloing, no strange artifacts, nice and round, no real cat's eyeing in the corner, so great job there. Now, something to be aware of that definitely can affect some people. Most people aren't going to care, but some people may care a whole lot, and that is if you are looking at the raw image of this uncorrected, this Sony 16 1.8, boy oh boy, you are going to see some massive barrel distortion. Now, Sony's doing that these days. They're relying on software fixes to straighten out the image so that they can make smaller and more compact and lighter lenses, but you are going to have to use your Lightroom profile or whatever profile you're using for your program, because that is some really big distortion. Now, the viltrox has a little bit, but it has nowhere near the same amount. So if you don't want to be applying those profiles and you're correcting by hand all the time, the viltrox might be an easier way to go. But this is sort of par for the course for the Sony lenses these days. The more compact they are making them, the more that they are relying on those profiles to straighten things out. If you're shooting JPEG or video, that won't be a problem because the profile will automatically be applied. When it comes to sunstars, I think both lenses do a really nice job with sunstars, which is great because if you're doing landscape photography with that wide angle, then you're going to have that sun in your photos sometimes, and you can stop that down, get those nice sunstars. Now, the Sony has 11 blades, so you're going to get a 22-point sunstar, whereas the viltrox has 9 blades, so you get an 18-point. I think the Sony one looks a little bit better, but nothing to complain about there on the viltrox sunstars. And both lenses do an excellent job of controlling flare and ghosting. Still lots of contrast in your image, even with a backlit subject. So, of course, Sony uses the best of the best coatings, and viltrox is starting to do that as well. When it comes to the chromatic aberration and longitudinal chromatic aberration, here is where we see one of the only wins for this viltrox lens, because even though they both perform exceptionally well when it comes to the lateral chromatic aberration, you can hardly detect any no matter how much pixel peeping you are doing. When it comes to the longitudinal chromatic aberration, again, both lenses are excellent, but the viltrox is almost perfect. You really don't see any longitudinal chromatic aberration in the areas out of focus in the foreground and the background. When you see color fringing, that is the Bokeh, and the Sony has a tiny bit, whereas the viltrox has almost none at all. But really, that's being pretty picky. You know what I'm saying? Now, a place I am not being picky is when it comes to stabilization. Now, neither lens has actual optical stabilization. No stabilization in the lens, but the Sony lenses work much better with Sony bodies when it comes to using the active stabilization. They just don't communicate as well with the third parties. So as you can see, when you're using Sony's active stabilization, the viltrox lens performs much worse than the Sony 16mm f1.8. Now, the good news is if you have a ZV-E1 that has dynamic active stabilization or the new A1 Mark II, then that kind of compensates for everything. So even if you have a third-party lens, you're still going to see very smooth footage. But if you're just using the active stabilization, things like the A7C II has, they don't have dynamic active stabilization, then in that case, you're going to want to stick with a first party if you're going to do a lot of handheld video work. So now let's talk about price. And I have to say, this is about the most aggressive I have ever seen Sony putting out a full frame lens. Like, I bought this 16 to 25 not too long ago for $1,200 USD. And they are telling me, because I got this pre-release, obviously I am one of the cool kids, so I can't confirm it, but hopefully it will be confirmed by the time you see this video. I will have it written in the description, but they are telling me this thing is probably going to be $799. And for a Sony full frame G lens, that is a really good price. It is only about $200 more than this viltrox lens, and that has surprised me greatly, and I think is going to make this a very big seller. If you are looking for a wide angle lens that has a fast aperture, I don't see why you wouldn't get this 16mm. The only reason I think to not get this is if you really want that zoom capabilities of this 16 to 25. But of course, you lose that 1.8 aperture and you got to settle for the 2.8. Still, a zoom is very useful, but it is much more expensive and bigger. Like, look at this small, lightweight, really well-built lens that you could just carry around all day that doesn't cost a fortune. I'm really impressed with this one. But let me know what you guys think down below. Are you impressed with this one? Is this something you would pick up, or would you opt for the 16 to 25 or maybe the 16 to 35 G Master? Let me know what you think. We'll have a nice little discussion about it. Thanks for watching this. We'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.